Good evening, welcome to Consider This. I'm Melissa Idris. So the third payment of the Bantuan Sara Hidup has been dispersed and 3.6 million Malaysians will be the recipients of some 1.23 billion ringgit under the third phase of disbursement. Now, taking a closer look at the effectiveness of cash transfer programs, joining us on the show tonight we have Kelvin Cheng, the researcher on economics, trade and regional integration at the think tank ISIS Malaysia. Also, Dr. Kenneth Simler, senior economist at the World Bank Global Knowledge and Research Hub. Welcome, gentlemen, to the show. So I want to talk a bit about Cost of Living Allowance, COLA, also known as Bantuan Sara Hidup or BSH, the National Cash Transfer Program, formerly known as BRIM, Bantuan Rakyat Satu Malaysia. We love our acronyms here, don't we?
Yes.
So let's, I guess, begin by tracing the evolution of BRIM or Bantuan Sara Hidup as we know it now. So BRIM conceptualized in 2011 under then Prime Minister Datuk Seri Najib Razak, disbursed in 2012, right?
Yep.
So maybe you guys can help us trace the kind of evolution of the cash transfer program. Who wants to take this? Ken?
You want to start off?
All right, Kelvin, you can set it up for us.
Well, as you mentioned, the first benefits were paid out in 2012. And then every year after that, it's just been, I think, just an increase in benefits every year. And then last year, it was changed to Bantuan Sara Hidup from BRIM. And I think that was probably one of the most drastic changes we've seen since the inception of BRIM, in that some of the categories were changed. And I think one of the more important things is that we had the addition of household size adjustment for the benefits, right? So
it's more than just cosmetic, more than just a name change.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So would you say it's a revamp of the entire program? Because now we're not just looking at giving cash handouts, it's a look at different eligibility criteria, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Right. No, I would say a course change, a course shift.
Absolutely.
Because the eligibility requirements were fairly similar to BRIM as far as the income thresholds and the other requirements for eligibility. And as Calvin mentioned, the big change was previously the amount of the benefit paid was the same for all households within a given income bracket. The BSH, when it was introduced last year in the budget speech, brought in this additional 120 ringgit per year for each child in the household under the age of 18, up to 4 children and beyond that. So it for the first time tied the level of the benefits to the composition of the household.
Right.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, so and you mentioned, Calvin, that there's been a steady increase in the total amount of Bantuan Sara Hidup or cash transfers that has been given out every year?
Yeah.
So does that mean more people or the money has just increased?
I think the money has increased. And I think if you look at since the beginning, there's definitely more people on it as well.
Okay.
I mean, compared to, if you compare 2018 to 2012, there's certainly an increase. But I think if you look at this year's new BSH, there's been a decrease of about 2 million recipients. And I think that was done mainly by the removal of the single, what they call BRIM Bujang, so the single, BRIM for singles.
Okay.
So that was another huge change in BSH. So I think that shaved off about 2 million recipients.
All right,
Yeah.
so the composition has changed, but the size has continued to grow in terms of money and recipients. Would that be accurate to say?
Well,
no.
it has increased up to 2018 in terms of the number of recipients, and then there's been a decrease in recipients since then. Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Right. And the amount of the benefits per household receiving it has increased over time, fairly incrementally.
Yeah, very marginally.
It's not.
Yeah.
It's been
I don't want to be misleading and say that it's very large. It has increased, but it's been very marginal.
And how would you, I guess, compare the differences in the effectiveness of what was then BRIM and what is now Bantuan Sara Hidup, given these different iterations?
Okay. The first qualifier is, while we have income data from the household income survey collected by the Department of Statistics Malaysia, for BRIM, we don't have it for Bantuan Sara Hidup because it was just introduced this year. That have not been collected at the household survey level yet.
Okay.
From looking at the design of the program, it appears to me that it should be somewhat more effective, and that mostly by taking into account size of households.
Okay. When you say effective, what is the I guess the goal at the end of the day, Ken?
The end of the day is to reduce poverty, is to address the needs of people who are living the lower end of the income distribution, whether it's the B40, the B20, the B10, and increasing their resources to carry on their life. So, so reducing monetary poverty, also reducing inequality, because it's a cash transfer.
And is cash transfer effective in reducing inequality? Because there are people who disagree fundamentally disagree with the ideology of cash transfer programs. They say it encourages a dependency mindset. It discourages work. What has research told us about that, Kelvin?
Right. So I think that's a very common trope that people like to throw about when they talk about cash transfers, typically accompanied by assertions that poor people are lazy and the sort. But I think the international evidence over the past 2 decades of hundreds of studies over many different programs around the world has shown that typically work disincentives resulting from cash transfers are very, very low. Typically, cash transfer recipients do not decrease work intensity, they do not decrease work hours, and some studies even show that some recipients increase work intensity, increase work hours. And there's been very little evidence that it sort of creates any sort of dependency. As we've seen, recipients increase their savings, they increase their investment, increase their production. Certainly on those things, the evidence is more mixed, but there's simply no evidence to show that there's any dependency or laziness arising from cash transfer programs.
Okay. I would agree. I mean, within any program, you will find outliers, you'll find exceptions, somebody who takes a good thing and ruins it. You'll also find some bad programs. There are programs that might be designed such that the benefit schedule provides a disincentive to work. Okay, but this is not, we have enough experience with this, there's enough world kind of evidence on this to work on that. And I would say there's, across the world, there's a lot of evidence that this cash transfers really can provide a very safe, very good safety net, very good safety net
I guess,
for these households.
A social protection program.
And if I could put in a plug for a former colleague, there's something called the Transfer Project, and I think it's transferproject.org, but where they've studied systematically and rigorously transfer programs across the globe, and most of them are highly successful.
I guess the reason I ask this is because there's been a lot of, especially in the past government, there was a lot of talk about the dependency on subsidies, right? That subsidy mindset, that you have to wean yourself off this sugar dependency, the sugar rush that you get when you have subsidies. So how does that jive, with the fact that research has shown that cash transfers are effective?
I think some of it is just the language used. I mean, for BRIM or for Bantuan Sara Hidup, you hear about cash handouts.
Yeah.
All right.
And typically, I try to push back on that term. I don't like using
You don't like the term cash handouts?
All right.
So you like cash transfers?
Cash transfers, cash
Does anyone who
assistance.
put RON 95 in their tank think they got a cash handout because of the fuel subsidy? They don't think about it that way, do they? All right. I don't know what the budgets are for what the budget is for the fuel subsidy, but it definitely reaches more people.
Yeah.
And it's not targeted at all. Other than basically, it's actually regressive in that that kind of subsidy in kind, it benefits the people who drive the biggest and the most cars.
Okay, so we should be thinking of it not as cash handouts, but rather cash transfers. I guess because there used to be the idea that cash handouts are politically motivated.
Oh, absolutely, and
has that kind of agenda.
Right.
But coming back to cash transfers between conditional cash transfers and unconditional cash transfers, Bantuan Sara Hidup is unconditional. There are no strings attached. You get the cash, you go and spend it as you see fit for your household. Do you think that perhaps Malaysia should be looking at conditional cash transfers, vouchers, for instance, other types of transfers? Would that be more effective in your opinion?
Well, I come partly from the standpoint that looking at cash puts the decision in the hands of the recipient, all right? So it empowers them to make their decisions, good or bad. That's one thing. And when you talk about conditional cash transfers in Malaysia, my next question would be then, what kind of behavior you're trying to encourage? In poorer countries, often it's encourage school attendance. School attendance is already very high in Malaysia. It could be going to clinics. That's also already very high. So what, rather than just coming up with a generic conditional cash transfer, think what condition you're trying to meet.
Right.
There could be some things out there. I haven't heard a convincing story yet, but I'm open.
Okay, all right. So it has to be targeted to a certain behavior that you want to encourage.
Absolutely.
Did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I want to add something in that making the program conditional, it's not an easy choice, right? It's not a free ride. You know, you think like, oh, schooling or health outcomes, that sounds like a great idea. It's like so simple, why wouldn't you do it? The reason why we don't do it, or why you may not want to do it, is because there are huge costs associated with imposing conditionality on recipients.
What kind of cost?
So the first cost is literal, right? So it makes it more expensive because policymakers have to enforce these conditions. They have to check periodically, are you attending school?
Right.
Are you meeting this requirement, meeting that requirement? And that's huge complexity, huge bureaucratic costs, and huge increases in monetary costs, right? And the second trade-off I would want to highlight is that imposing conditions can sort of put the burden on the poorest households the most. So it's often the poorest who can't meet these conditions, and if they can't meet these conditions in a strictly conditional cash transfer program, they get cut off, so they don't get assistance.
They fall
so
through
they
the
fall
cracks,
through
right?
the cracks,
Okay.
absolutely. So I think that those costs are very large and sort of argue against why we shouldn't impose a conditional cash transfer program in BRIM at this BSH at this time.
Okay, all right. We're going to continue this conversation on Bantuan Sara Hidup after this, specifically looking at who should be receiving it. Stay tuned to consider this. Welcome back to Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris. With me on the show, Kelvin Cheng from ISIS Malaysia, as well as Dr. Kenneth Simla from the World Bank Global Knowledge and Research Hub. We're talking about Bantuan Sara Hidup, and you know, there's been a lot of conversation these past few days about poverty and the, I guess, the 0.4% poverty rate here in Malaysia. This was after the UN Special Rapporteur came to town and created quite a stir. Now, one of the things that came out from that really interested me was a focus on the multi-dimensional poverty index that was introduced as a poverty measurement in the 11th Malaysia Plan. Now, could you help us get a better understanding about what that multi-dimensional poverty index is?
Sure thing. It's something that has been gaining in popularity across the world. The World Development Report in 2010, put up by the UN, introduced a systematic approach to multidimensional poverty measurement. And what it is, the one in Malaysia, and also one that the World Bank uses, recognizes monetary income as one aspect of poverty, but also other non-monetary aspects of well-being that should be considered. One that's usually used and is used in Malaysia is education, is access to education, number of years of school completed. Another has to do with health, with access to clean drinking water and good sanitation. And another is living quarters in good condition. Okay. So it's recognized that people might have enough money to be above the poverty line, the monetary poverty line, but might be deprived in other areas.
Okay.
And that this is also important for well-being, and that will should shape policy.
All right, so when we're thinking about social protection programs, the government is viewing it through this multi-dimensional poverty lens, so to speak. Calvin, what do you think about the social protection programs that we have currently? Do you think that they're targeting the right people?
Well, first off, I'd like to say that you know, it's well known that social assistance programs in Malaysia are very fragmented. They are administered by many different ministries, many different agencies.
How many? Do we know?
Oh, we don't even have, I don't have the exact numbers.
Fragmented, okay.
Yeah.
Perhaps every ministry has some kind of program, right?
It seems that way.
Close to it.
So, yeah, I think that definitely hampers efforts at targeting, especially since there is a little coordination between the ministries, between the agencies, and often there's a variety of different kinds of assistance that sort of overlap, right? They sort of almost duplicate each other.
Right.
So
targeting the same people, perhaps, you know, there's overlap there, is it?
Absolutely, yeah. And even if we're talking specifically about BRIM, or BSH rather, we do see like targeting errors, exclusion and inclusion errors that are somewhat significant, I would say.
In what way?
Well, for example, exclusion errors, so undercoverage. So there are poor households which meet the income eligibility requirements, but they don't receive BRIM, BSH. And that could be a targeting problem. It could be an information problem. It could be that applying for BSH is, they don't know how to apply it, or it could also be the fact that, as Ken mentioned, their household size does not tie in with the eligibility requirements, right? So they could be a very large household, but they earn more than the 4,000 threshold and they do not receive these benefits.
Right, because with the current Bantuan Sara Hidup, households with a monthly income of more than 4,000, so if you earn 4,001 ringgit a month, even if you have 10 children, you're still not eligible for that.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right. And that's, I think, so as far as are we targeting the right people, I'd say almost, all right? But by using this income per household threshold, whether it's the 4,000 in or out of BRIM or the 3,000 and 2,000 cutoffs that determine how much benefit you get, it could be improved by taking into account household size. Okay. How many people is that 2,000 or 3,000 or 4,000 ringgit per month providing for?
I see.
And that's a fairly simple change to the system that would improve the targeting.
So, there was also a debate that was happening after the UN Special Rapporteur was, talking not just about the measure of poverty, but also whether, the assistance that the government is targeting the B40, that's 40%, right, of the entire population of Malaysia, whether that is specific enough. Should we be looking at such a breadth of social protection versus a depth where you're targeting perhaps the ones who really need it the most?
That's a great point, and I think that it could be targeted better to the B20 or B15. B40 is it's close to half the population.
Yeah.
And because of that, people have the sense maybe that a lot is spent as a Bantuan Sara Hidup, but that's because it's going to a lot of people. The actual amount of benefit per household is quite small by world standards, and our analysis shows that it doesn't have that much impact on their incomes. If you could focus now, lower income households, those below 2,000 get more than those below 3,000. So there's some of that progressivity in there, but it's very limited.
Okay. And Calvin, do you have anything to add to that?
Absolutely. I think as well as talking about breadth, right? So obviously the households in the B10 or the B20 have certainly different needs than households in the B40, and they will require different kinds of assistance as compared to households in the B40, right? And I think if you look at a BSH, it's one of the most widely targeted cash transfer programs in comparison to other international cash transfer programs in the world, right? So currently the targeting moves all the way up, even reaching the B40 threshold to reaching some of that lower M40 level, whereas most cash transfer programs around the world target quite narrowly around the poverty line.
So should we be looking at narrowing the target? Should we be looking at focusing on that? Because, while I think a lot of people in the B40, I guess, are happy with the cash transfer, and it does go some ways in helping them, should we be looking at spending that money? Should the government be looking at spending that money differently?
So, could spend it differently. I think also that the call has to be made for spending more.
Spending more.
Spending more.
Spending more.
Right. Our work is showing what we call adequacy. The percentage of the benefit from BSH as a percentage of recipients' income is about 5%. So it's quite small. Now you can keep it hitting the B40 and then increase the amounts for the lower end.
Wow.
You could scale it down. So both spending smarter, but also I think spending more. And
Okay, spending smarter and spending more. We're going to come back and talk more about Bantuan Sara Hidup. Make sure you stay tuned to consider this. Thank you for staying with us on Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris with Dr. Kenneth Simler, better known as Ken, Senior Economist at the World Bank Global Knowledge and Research Hub. Also, Calvin Cheng, researcher on economics, trade and regional integration at the think tank ISIS Malaysia. So in conclusion, gentlemen, I really want to take a look at what can be done to further improve Bantuan Sara Hidup, right? in which areas do you think Bantuan Sara Hidup can be tweaked so it becomes more effective? Ken, would you like to start?
I'd say when I first started analyzing this, I thought it would be improving the targeting.
Okay.
And after working a lot with household income survey data, doing some quantitative analysis, I'm not convinced it's more the depth, as we were talking about earlier, that it's really the amounts that even if you end up targeting this perfectly to the households at the bottom end of the income distribution, that it's not going to have a bigger impact unless the benefits received are larger.
Okay.
So you can multiply that effect by having better targeting as well, but the main outcome from our research is that really increasing the level of the benefits.
Increasing the level of benefits. Right. So, as you mentioned, spending more on social safety. You know, one thing that you said before that just kind of struck me, I just thought it sounds like Malaysia is spending quite a bit on cash transfers. In fact, there was a lot of talk about reducing it, or in fact, cancelling the program entirely last year. There was chatter on that. But you're saying we should be spending more, and given the, I guess, the fiscal discipline that Putrajaya is trying to instill, how would you justify that? Say you're in consultation with the government. How would you say, Pakatan Harapan, I think you need to be spending more money on these programs. What would be your justification? All right,
it would be, and I wasn't clear on this before, spending more on BSH, maybe not spending more in total. For example, I mentioned fuel subsidies before, which are untargeted, which are actually regressive. Okay, they go mostly to higher income households. They actually exacerbate inequality. There's been a move, I know, to monetize the fuel subsidy, talking about targeting that towards the B40, possibly even having no fuel connection at all. That sum of money go into a top-up to BSH. Okay. And I think that would be a very fruitful way to go.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, thank you for clarifying that. Okay, Calvin, what about you? What are some of the recommendations that you think can be made to BSH?
Well, Melissa, I think I'm in complete agreement with Ken here that I think we both reached one of the same conclusions, is that BSH benefit size has to be increased. So currently you mentioned that we're spending a lot on BSH benefits, but in fact it's only about, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's only about 0.3% of GDP. When you compare that with international cash transfer programs around the world, typically on average you'd find about 1% of GDP spend, and that's total costs. So there's certainly a lot of room there for an increase. And even if you look at how much the benefits are, like for per household, right? So currently, if you have 2 kids and household income of 2,000 per month and below, you receive about 1,480. And that is only about around 8% of pre-programmed consumption, right? So international evidence suggests that a threshold of about 20% is deemed to be more beneficial, more transformative, and that creates more powerful benefits for poor households,
20%,
right? 20%. So now we're at 8.8%.
Right, that's a
significant amount. I'm not saying we have to go that high, but it just shows how much room we have for that
to go. And at what point does it become effective? Is that, so you said the threshold is 20%, right?
20% is just, I guess, the sweet spot.
Right, and if you look at other countries, especially Latin America or Europe, you see, including Eastern Central Europe, some 15 to 30% as far as the proportion of total household income that comes from the benefit. But even Thailand has a program of 13%.
Okay. One thing that we didn't touch on is the concept that cash transfers tend to be short-term, right? It is a short-term gap, a stopgap measure in terms of reducing poverty. It doesn't so much address inequality. So it doesn't quite reduce inequality in a country. So cash cannot be the only way to provide social safety, social assistance programs. What other ways should we be thinking about this, Ken?
Okay. Well, on the inequality question, I would say actually in this case it both reduces poverty and reduces inequality.
Okay.
Because of the targeting, the benefits are going to low-income households and not high-income households. Presumably the high-income households are paying more taxes than the low-income households that fund the program. So we see both benefiting both in terms of reducing income inequality and reducing income poverty.
So cash transfers in the long run help in reducing inequality.
Yes, if they're designed sensibly, which most of them are.
Kelvin?
But I think the international evidence has been moving towards a point where people have been realizing that cash alone is less effective than cash plus, right? So what I'm talking about is like cash plus some other kind of assistance effort that helps to bolster the effects that even make it even greater of an effect than doing either one alone, right? So one thing we've seen is that cash plus supply side investment in education and health infrastructure, and that certainly has very powerful effects than doing either one alone.
Okay, so also looking at the entire ecosystem in terms of fixing, I guess, the fundamental issues within the country. Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us today. It's been a real pleasure discussing Bantuan Sara Hidup, and I have to say, you've changed my mind in the way I've been thinking about these cash transfer programs. Perhaps we'll keep this conversation going, making sure that our social assistance programs are, I guess, going to the people who need it the most. You've been watching Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris, and I will be back with you same time tomorrow. Make sure you catch me then. Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for that. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks.